Good Monday morning, everyone. It is another edition of hashtag Malkin Live. It's also the beginning of February, so happy February, everyone. And as I mentioned to you over the weekend, I've got a very special guest. I'm going to bring him in right away. He is Matt Brainard of Look Ahead America.org. Hey, Matt, it's so great to see you again. Last time we saw each other was in Phoenix. It's been harrowing, but I had to have you on because I think that this is going to be a show that's going to give people hope, direction, and a concrete action plan. Can you let everyone know what you've been doing since there's a lot of things I could call it, but I want to make sure that this live stream stays up. But the events of last November.
Right. Well, I and my research group, we struggled somewhat because a lot of what we were trying to do, we didn't really have an outlet to present our findings, what we discovered. And a lot of what we discovered was very troubling. And we didn't have, I don't know, we could talk about it online, we could make videos, but there was no action behind it. No way to really have an impact. And the way we ended up kind of having an impact was, we're in two ways that we're at a crossroads to each other, because the two ways made each other difficult. One was through the courtrooms, and between legal decisions made by the president's team and a very hostile judiciary, it was very hard to make any progress there. But because so much of our evidence and testimony was tied up in that, it limited our ability to get in front of state legislatures. So I would go in front of a state legislature and somebody would ask a really good, challenging question, and I couldn't really answer that question because it would kind of make the attorneys I was working with look bad, and that could hurt the case. So you're always I was sort of in this net of, I think, a net of dysfunction at those two cross purposes. But for better or worse, since that is all past, we now have a lot more liberty to take action. So in terms of the research we did in 2020, right now we're finishing some of our research, fortifying some of our findings, and we'll be rolling them out in 3 particularly important states of Georgia, Wisconsin, and Arizona. I don't want to share our conclusions. I don't want to get the stream in trouble per se, but there are some noteworthy things given the number of, let's call them, very potentially illegal ballots and the margins of victories. An odd thing happening with those numbers in those states. And we'll be pushing the case in each of those in different ways of publicizing it to establish the record. Because I'm not sure it's not going to change the outcome of the election. It's not going to change who's in the White House. Okay, we've got to be realistic here. But we also have to remember that in the year 2000, there were 3 media audits of just one state's election, Florida. And they took 7 months after the election and millions of dollars to reach their conclusion ultimately that George W. Bush did win Florida. If they found something different, wow, I couldn't imagine what the first 4 years of his administration would have been like, but they concluded he did win by a couple hundred votes. The point being is that there's value in this research, and what we discover, what we find, what we'll release, I think will have an impact. And we now have the freedom to sort of take that forward in a way that isn't constrained by, say, legal concerns of endangering a lawsuit or some agenda that a state legislator might have.
Right. And just to do 101 here for folks who may not recognize you right off the bat, which everybody should, Matt Brainard is the former Trump voter data election guru who heads an organization called Look Ahead America.org. And of course, prior to the election, crowdsourced an extraordinary project called the Voter Integrity Project, whose data was used and incorporated into many of these lawsuits. And of course, that's information that so much of Silicon Valley is trying to stifle. And I joked over the weekend when I did a live stream sort of pre-announcing your appearance here that I can't even say the words, right? So I said it rhymes with selection mod.
Very clever.
Right? I mean, yeah. So this is the America that we live in now, that we can't even say such things without fear of being censored. But what you're doing now, of course, is mobilizing the grassroots, many of them who feel so not only disenfranchised, but disempowered, and very sort of despondent about the future of our country, but there are actually things they can do.
That's correct. This is a very difficult battle that we're in. And it's important that when you're in these types of conflicts, that you recognize where your strengths are and you leverage your strengths, you leverage your assets. You look at Washington, D.C., where I am, and we don't see a whole lot of assets here. We don't, the patriotic cause, I'm going to speak in C3 language because Look Ahead America is a 501c3 nonpartisan. We don't find a lot of patriotic spirit here in DC, in the leadership, political and otherwise. But when you look across the country, there are, I would say, a majority of the state legislatures are very friendly to the patriotic agenda. And that agenda includes things like fighting tech censorship, cracking down on abusive H-1Bs, as well as fighting for, I think, what we would agree is maybe the most important, which is voter integrity. So in comes Look Ahead America. Now, I started Look Ahead America initially as an antidote to ACORN, an antidote to the left-wing endeavors to register, educate, and turn out to vote their voters. Because I know I've got a database of millions of Americans who are supportive of the patriotic cause, but are not registered to vote, or incidentally registered to vote, but just don't care enough to show up at the ballots, or it doesn't click with them how important it is that they show up and vote. However, we've expanded our purpose, and now we're doing something what I will call guiding, educating, and coordinating. At the state legislative level, we're coming up with policy initiatives on different issues, and our most important will be releasing formally in about a week on the issue of voter integrity reforms. These are reforms that can take place within a state legislature or through a statewide initiative that will fix many of the problems that we saw in the November 2020 election. The second thing we're doing is training people or educating them on how to become activists, how to lobby their state legislatures, how to organize with other similar-minded citizens in their state. And just a week ago, we had our first training session. We had over 1,000 people, or I should say 1,000 live viewers of the stream. In many cases, I got word that there were several people gathered around to watch from the same screen. So we're not even sure how many people saw our presentation, but we were explaining to them how to effectively lobby their state legislatures. Now, you and I know from spending time in DC that you're not really going to get your congressman's attention, or much less your senator's attention. You might stop by the office. If you're very lucky, you'll get a photo up, but you're not really going to get them to pay much attention to your issue, even if you come in with all of your neighbors. But your state legislator, your state senator, are a very different story. Yes. They're much more likely to entertain or engage with you on the issues that are close to you because they themselves are closer to you. They represent smaller portions of the population in pretty much every state. So that's where we want people to get engaged. And finally, we're doing coordination with them. So we've got all of these people who've come to us, told us, look, I want to get active in my state. I want to fight for voter integrity. I want to fight against corporate censorship. Put us together. And we're appointing state level and sub-state level coordinators to organize you so that when you go talk to your legislature, they're all getting the message at the same time. So it has a real impact. So that's kind of the outgrowth of our grassroots activism. And I really look forward. I plan on Monday, we'll be releasing our initiatives on voter integrity reform. On the 15th, we'll have another activist training session, and we'll continue to coordinate people, continue to put them in touch with other people within this network so that they can start to have an impact on patriotic issues, because there's no one else doing it on our side.
Yeah. Why is that? I mean, you and I have been involved in the grassroots conservative movement for many, many years now. I've tracked this for 25, 30 years, and there's hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in conservative philanthropy that's been poured into DC-based organizations. Why are you the first?
I think part of it is because many of the agendas you see being pushed in DC and at the state levels, which gets very little coverage, they're attached to something called a moneyed interest. And while the themes might connect to conservative ideas, and many of them may actually be, good policies they're pushing, fundamentally good, they often are associated with somebody being able to look at the bottom line of their company and make a profit. And that provides a tremendous motivation for funding. And the reality is that funding matters. I mean, we from the very beginning of the Voter Integrity Project, 2 days after the election, when I tried to begin it, we immediately needed to spend about $100,000 just on data, just $100 like that. We ultimately ended up spending, I think, close to $200,000 on data and data processing to be able to do the investigation that the state should have been doing, yada, yada. But, you know, and the thing is, if you don't have that big investor to support you, you're kind of screwed. What was nice about Voter Integrity Project, though, is that, I mean, we raised that money from about 9,000 voters, and it was mostly small dollar amounts. Our largest contributor to the entire project, there was one, he gave 30,000. The next largest gave 10, and then 5, and then a lot of 1,000 donors, and but a sea of $25 donors, and that's been the case we've seen so far with Look at America. Now, there are folks who care enough about their country. They've been very successful financially, and they're willing to contribute to something like us. And we're having those discussions because, you know, the sooner I have money, the sooner I can put field staff out there and can start doing in-person trainings in the state and start doing some really aggressive voter integrity work as well as voter registration work. I mean, I talk about illegal ballots a lot, but I will tell you what had a much bigger impact in all of the contested states than illegal ballots were the tremendous number of new registered voters the left was able to find and turn out to vote. I walked through entire neighborhoods after the election doing a special canvassing project in Georgia, in Fulton County, entire neighborhoods that Stacey Abrams had registered to vote. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason she was able to do that was because Mark Zuckerberg drove a truck up to her house full of cash and emptied it. And that provided a lot of the resources she needed to engage in that. And the left has been dumping, over the last 4 years, the left has dumped hundreds of millions of dollars into voter registration and voter education, voter agitation to get these people to turn out, while at the same time lowering the threshold to vote with drop boxes and semi-legal ballot harvesting initiatives. But nothing really on our side. Nobody was out there going out to, like, standing outside of Costco, standing outside of a rural high school football game, all going to a evangelical Hispanic church where they mostly speak English, and as a C3 and saying, look, you care about these patriotic issues. This is your country. You know, we've got to fight for it. You've got to register to vote and turn out to vote. Nobody was doing that. And, you know, that's sort of where we are. And that's the space that I want Look Ahead America to be in and to be moving in over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and because people feel so disenfranchised, it's a really ripe opportunity to leverage people's frustration and anger into actual concrete lasting action. But I'm looking at comments here, and I want you to answer this one. This is Mike Robinson, and he says, why vote if they're the counters?
That's a good question, but it's also one of the things that I feared most about what was the acronym you used, or the other, what's the rhyming term? Remind me.
Selection mod.
Selection mod. Okay.
Selection mod.
One of the big problems with it, there are 3 big problems with it. Number one problem with it is that it happens and it can affect the outcome of the election. And in the New York Times wrote a wonderful piece about how it can affect the outcome of the election. But they wrote that in 2012.
Right.
In a different world. The facts are the same. The second problem with it is that it is unfortunately distracting from what I suggested was a much bigger problem, was the voter registration deficit between progressives and patriotic. Because when I started the Voter Integrity Project, I wasn't going out to try to find problems. I was going to find out if problems occurred. And if I was really hoping I could come out and say, hey, clean election and just marginal stuff didn't make a difference, whatever. Unfortunately, that's not what I found. But is that has taken up so much energy that people want to talk about, people want to even contribute to. But when you talk about the hard work of standing outside a Costco for 18 hours a day when there's a football game on, right, that's really hard. But that's what really is making the difference. But the third problem is the cynicism. Now, when I first started doing the Voter Integrity Project, I thought that the left would actually be enthusiastic supporters, assuming I was clean, right? Assuming if you're a Biden supporter, you surely want the country to think, completely clean election. Let's give this guy some support, because if he finds nothing, he'll really help tamp down the division that's happening because of people doubting the outcome.
Yeah. No
one did.
Yeah.
And I came to learn that I think that the cynicism about elections, about selection mod, the left intentionally fans the flames of that to make it seem like a much bigger and insurmountable problem than it is. Exactly because of the question he just asked. Because if you think your vote doesn't matter, if you think that it's not going to count because of mechanisms designed to invalidate it, well, that completely demoralizes you and makes it less likely you're going to show up and vote in the future. So the notion of this, whether it's as big as we think it is, or some people think it was absolutely huge. I think it's limited. I think it had an impact, but it was limited. But I think the notion that it doesn't make a difference, that is true. And you saw that happen in Georgia in the runoff. When you saw the number of voters, there's a lot of reasons why people may not have gone out to vote for those two candidates. Okay. And I know this is controversial. I'm of the school that I do not make the perfect the enemy of the good enough. But when you saw the numbers drop among, say, conservatives turning out versus left, I think a big factor of that is just demoralization. So the lesson I have to you is that, yes, your vote does count, and getting the system fixed will require you to vote, and require you not just to vote, because that's not enough anymore, but you have got to go see your state legislator, your state senator, organize your neighbors, and go. And I'll make a point, because a lot of the stuff I'm asking people to do for Look Ahead America, look, we had a 3-hour seminar on I think it was a Wednesday night. We're going to have another 3-hour, not easy to sit through, a little boring, and the work that follows, very boring. But remember, the founders of this country, on Christmas night, in the freezing cold, crossed the Delaware to make war. All I'm asking you to do is write a few letters, maybe drive to your state capital or organize something for. So if our founders could make that kind of sacrifice, the very least you can do, because I don't know where we get this expectation that our forefathers who fought World War II, World War I, all of the wars before, going all the way back to the Revolution, that somehow we're entitled to have it easy on ourselves, that we're entitled to not have the same level of struggle that they've had. And then we're not even suggesting that level of struggle. I'm just saying, you got to get off your couch. You got to go to the seminar. You got to sign up. When our state coordinator calls you got to show up and fight for this voter integrity law, fight for all of these initiatives that we're going to be rolling out, and fighting to register all the people in your neighborhood and get them to turn out to vote. That is our fight. That is our fight right now.
Right. Absolutely. I want to read another comment, and then I want to go over your voter integrity reform action items listed on the website. Kathy McElhaney says, I will not vote until they straighten this BS out. And if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're dedicated to is recruiting people to straighten it out and not just sit there and wait for it. And here on the website, it might be a little bit small, so I just want to read out loud. Your voter integrity reform items include: number 1, mandating the authentication of absentee ballots; number 2, banning the black box voting equipment and requiring all election hardware and software be open source; 3, requiring aggressive voter list hygiene by the state, clean voter rolls, balancing the list against the NCOA database, and I want you to explain that, plus the federal government SAVE program for detecting non-citizens. That's a huge issue, always has been. I started out my career in LA in the early 1990s, several notable congressional races that were razor-thin margins, and illegal aliens probably made the difference in those races. Number 4, allocating the resource and manpower with the state attorney general's office to investigate and prosecute voter fraud. So, the message, people, is if you don't take this into your own hands, then you're accountable for that.
Right. And I there's a very interesting word in the quote you have up from Kathy McElhaney. Thank you very much for watching. So don't take too personally what I'm about to say, but I've gotten that question before. There's a problem with that question, is that there is no they. There's just you and me. There is no, and those of us here, there is no they. There's no one coming to your rescue. There's no one who is saying, Kathy is upset that the elections aren't working right. We need to fix these things for her so she comes back and votes. There is no they. There never has been. And that is the struggle that we're in. And this buying into, like, I boycott like a local restaurant here, because when I order the Diet Coke, it always comes flat. So I'm not going, right? And I'll send a letter to the manager, and they actually care about that, right? But this is not what political parties or election systems, that's not how they operate. There's there's not somebody, there's no customer service concern in the election system or within the government. If you don't show up and vote, you basically make yourself a complete zero. You're a complete zero. So you've got to engage. You've got to get engaged locally. You've got to fix the system because it's on our shoulders. There's no one else.
Yes. Here's Patty, who says we have to start holding elected officials accountable. It starts with local elections like county and city officials and moves up to state and federal. And that is your focus. And I think more people realized this past election cycle more than ever how key state legislators can be on the national scene.
Right. And that's going to be the case with all of our legislative initiatives. Fundamentally, here's how it works: is you get a few hundred citizens in a given state to sort of lobby their state legislatures, state senators, and what's likely going to happen is they're going to find that one or two potential champions who are going to, in the legislature, say, look, I care about this issue, this is important. They'll take the policy objectives, turn it into legislative council officers, which is something they have, turn it into a piece of legislation and sponsor it. And then they go to work on their colleagues. But and then things can start to go your way. The governor jumps on it. It's great. Florida has already jumped on one of our initiatives that the governor has that we've already announced. But that's how it starts. But that you got to find that initial champion who's going to be your icebreaker. And if you think about how the icebreaker works, they go through and break it apart, and then all the other weaker ships can follow. So that's really what it's going to come down to: is you guys in your states finding those champions and making sure you've got their back and giving them all the support they need to let this happen. Because here's the other thing we have to think about: patience. Everything the left seems to have achieved now or seems to achieve in the last election, this has been like a 100-year project for them.
Yes.
Universal healthcare, 100-year project. So we have to be patient with ourselves, especially at the state legislative level, is that it's not going to happen. You're not going to show up and have an instant result. It might take a session, might take a couple sessions. But here's the thing, you only really lose the fight when you give up and stop fighting. Yeah,
absolutely. Ava Phillips agrees with you. Excellent point. There is no they. So, so the next session, can you repeat that again and let people know where they can sign up?
Sure. We're still working out some of the logistics. Mm-hmm. I was very happy with how our first session went, but we're always looking for improvement. That's the one thing there is always room for. There's always room for improvement. And our next session is the weekend after Valentine's Day is on a weekend. So everybody should be in a very good mood on Monday coming back. And it'll be that Monday on the 15th. It'll be in the evening. We'll be announcing it on all of our platforms when you can start to register for it. But I think about a week out is when we'll start setting up registration. It'll probably be about 3 hours. It will probably run from 8 p.m. Eastern to 11 p.m. Our last one was 7 to 10 Eastern, but that's a little close for some of the folks on the left coast. So, we're continuing to calibrate these. And our dream, though, is to do these in person in each of the states where we have a presence, because I don't think there's anybody with kids who's been in a state that's on lockdown knows that Zoom learning is not quite the same as in person.
Yeah, that's true. Particularly for that, I mean, that the whole point of grassroots organizing is that sense of engagement and intimacy and forging community. And there really is no replacement for doing that other than being in the same room with people and making those physical connections as well.
Yeah, because it's not just a period of instruction; it's also a networking opportunity. Because if you're in Colorado.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you're going to be with a group of 20 to 50 other people training and learning certain techniques. And it's also a great opportunity to network and start to organize and say, okay, look, this is the day we're going to go hit our state legislature and make them pay attention to issues like voter integrity.
Right. I want to talk about another important initiative that you've undertaken, and you tweeted this out recently. I want people to know about this because they may have friends who are in need of the kind of help that a lot of DC establishment organizations are not providing. Let's see if I can bring this up. This is a letter that you released on the 29th, late last week, addressed to the Acting Attorney General, Robert Wilkinson, and FBI Director Christopher Wray. Tell us what this is all about.
Right. So there there was a largely peaceful protest, in the words of CNN, at the Capitol and at the White House on January 6th of this year. There were a few people who committed serious crimes. They assaulted police officers, committed property damage, other serious crimes, and they deserve to be prosecuted. Unfortunately, there were a lot of people who, with no real knowledge of committing a crime, were caught up in, they walked into the Capitol building, a public building, through an open door. They took smiling selfies with Capitol Police and had no idea that there was anything wrong with what they were doing. And now they're facing federal charges. They're facing tremendous legal costs if they can find a lawyer. They're losing jobs. They're being suspended without pay. And I think what's happening here is it's not prosecution, it's persecution. And the reason these people are being persecuted is because of their political beliefs. And again, I want to make clear, this letter, I asked the Department of Justice drop all charges against any of the nonviolent protesters from January 6th at the Capitol. And I laid out explicitly the legal reasoning, as well as reasoning, as constitutional reasoning, as well as reasons of fairness. Because what we had during the Kavanaugh confirmation were repeatedly individuals storming the Capitol, intimidating senators, trying to prevent the Senate from doing its business, which was confirming Justice Kavanaugh. And these people were refusing to leave unless they were arrested. They were processed off-site, no bail, at best fined between $35 and $50. These people, who happened again to do almost the same thing, but I think with less maliciousness, of course, unarmed, walked into a public building, open doors, no idea that there was anything wrong with that, and facing bail of $100,000 or $750,000 in cases where the prosecution doesn't even want them to be able to receive bail, and facing very serious charges, which can have very detrimental impact. And in total, there are about 800 people that the federal government is trying to track down. So far, there have been about 150 arrests, but the vast majority of them are people who didn't do anything violent or otherwise criminal, other than just happening to be, in a building they weren't supposed to be in. And I think, given what we saw at Trump's inauguration, where over 200 people were arrested for violence, like real violence, assaulting police officers, destroying police cars, destroying property, setting stuff on fire, and had all of their charges dropped. For these people, these patriotic folks who thought they were going to a peaceful rally, thought it was appropriate to walk into the building, to face having their lives destroyed, is completely wrong. And I really applaud you for bringing me on to talk about this, because so far there's been very little interest in it. Some of the OAN folks have talked about it a little bit. Jack Posobiec talked to you about it. A few others are kind of interested, but there's nobody on the right standing up for this. And I want to make a point, is that when terrorists were in the Middle East, killing civilians, setting bombs off, killing U.S. soldiers, and captured and brought to Guantanamo, the left was cheerleading attorneys to go down to Guantanamo and represent them pro bono.
Yes.
Now, I'm talking here about these folks who, grandmas, family members who've got, really simple backgrounds. Many of them are not politically astute. They're political neophytes going to a rally, walking through an open door, and now they're facing having their lives ruined. And there's no one seems to be bothered by this.
No, I mean, these same types of people are leading the witch hunts against peaceful Capitol rally attendees who are being lumped in for very politically advantageous reasons for the left, lumped in with those few who did commit acts of violence or vandalism, trespassing, and whatnot. And the reason why there aren't more people applauding what you are doing, Matt, and I have to thank you, is because of cowardice. And I think a moral failing, because they don't want the spotlight turned on them. They don't want to have to deal with the slings and arrows of being unjustly accused of supporting domestic terrorism. And we see that in the swamp too. There are very few elected Republican officials who are defending the largely peaceful protesters at the Capitol rally, when many of them themselves were attending Stop the Steal rallies just a few weeks prior. and I have heard from many, and I know you have too, who are facing these very daunting political persecutions and prosecutions now. This raises the point, though, and as you alluded to earlier, Matt, that this is a long game for the left, right? They have worked very hard to put DAs, and not just Soros DAs, right? They don't have to officially be subsidized by Soros PACs to be Soros adjacent or Soros aligned. These are the very types of people who, when they first come into office, their first act, like Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, is to announce that they will not be bringing criminal charges for low-level petty crimes. The types of DAs that are in the Pacific Northwest, where I worked in the late 1990s, who have let Antifa and BLM run rampant. And there's a revolving door for those types of people. But the patriots now facing some of these charges could be in prison for 10, 15, 20 years. And you raised the point too, Matt, that a lot of them are unable to secure good private lawyers, or ending up with public defenders who are hostile to them.
Right. And I mean, two examples. This one, when I was working on this letter, I'm not an attorney by trade, and I wanted to find an attorney that could help me, because the letter I think is really solid. I'm happy with how it came out. But I was talking to one attorney, one of the most prominent Republican attorneys in the country, hands down. I talked to him about this, and he said, well, there's a couple of problems with, this effort, and there's a couple of problems with the folks who got busted on, essentially for walking through an open door of a public building, right, and nothing more. And he said that we on the right don't have a lot of experience defending people like this, because all the rioters who did real violence during Trump's inauguration had an army of ACLU folks ready to represent them and tell them to keep their mouths shut. And if they hang together, they'll get through it. And he said that, well, on the right, we don't have many people who are experienced with that. But also, there's a quote unquote optics problem with helping them out. Another person I know is a college professor, conservative legal professor. Some of the people who were busted reached out to him and said, hey, can you give us an attorney? Can you help us connect us with an attorney? He tried. He reached several Republican attorneys, shouldn't say Republican, but friendly attorneys who were willing to take the cases. But then those attorneys were told by their firms they would not be allowed to take such a case.
Wow. I really liked your point about all of the corporate attorneys volunteering for Guantanamo detainees. And I did a lot of reporting on this about 10, 15 years ago. The leading white shoe law firm in DC and New York, Covington and Burling, pretty much every single senior attorney on their staff, I mean, it's like they each had a Guantanamo detainee assigned to them. And then they do all of that work pro bono and then get all of the awards and accolades, and those go on the law firm website and whatnot. And if I'm not mistaken, because Chuck Grassley was the one that made a big fuss about this about 10 years ago, a lot of those lawyers ended up as political appointees in the Obama Justice Department, and they could still very well be there now.
Yeah, exactly. And they're probably going through the revolving door now of the basically the third Obama administration.
Right. So there are no rewards in the legal community for taking up the cause of peaceful protesters on the right. But there are full rewards for taking up, and whatever, organizing the bail funds and, working pro bono in some capacity, whatever, in concert with the ACLU or the National Lawyers Guild. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of those legal organizations, along with their aligned adjacent nonprofit groups. But this kind of infrastructure never has existed on the right.
That's absolutely correct. And now that there's sort of an opportunity to make some progress in this area, why is it me? I'm kind of a nobody. I'm going to make an adjustment here. But why am I the guy that wrote the letter? Why isn't it? Well, I'm not going to name names. I don't want to call anybody out. But
yeah,
very serious. I mean, come on. I run a voter registration C3. This is. Yeah. And I was hoping that somebody else would, because somebody mentioned to me, this is a little bit different from the field you're going in. Are you worried that this will hurt your ability to raise money from donors my answer was, well, it's the right thing to do and nobody else is doing it. And these are our people.
Yes, yes, that is the point. And I will say one name. I think I just have to be compelled here. These are Trump supporters. These are Trump's people, and they stood by him through thick and thin for 4 years. These are not GOP people, right? These are not Con Inc. swamp people. And there were a lot of Trump tied organizations that enjoyed some good times over the last 4 years. Did they just disappear? I mean, what happened to all of that infrastructure? What happened to all of that funding? I mean, maybe they will be around, but I think the lesson that you're teaching here right now is it doesn't take more than one person to stand in the gap to make a difference. Stand in the gap.
Yeah, well, and my hope here is that it will eventually maybe it's just the beginning, and that hopefully some bit heavier artillery will come into the gap, and where hopefully there's no reason, and there have been stories written that inside the Department of Justice there's been some debate what to do about these charges, and there's some folks who want to say, hey, it's not a big deal, we've dealt with this with Kavanaugh, and other folks are like, nope, we're going to crucify these folks because they're Trump supporters, and we can't quite get to him, but we're going to grind his people into, basically drop his people into human meat grinder and ruin their lives. So hopefully there will be more. And, one thing I'm not sure what the next step necessarily is after this letter, but something I'm looking at and considering is perhaps like a small rally outside the Department of Justice to deliver this message in person to the Attorney General and say, look, you got to drop these charges. And the believe it or not, the permitting process for getting a rally in DC is a little more difficult these days, but we're looking into it. So maybe if we could perhaps get a couple dozen people to show up, maybe that would bring some attention to the issue.
I like that idea, and I really like just brainstorming about this with you right now. We've got a lot of people in comments, and hopefully they'll follow up with both of us. And by the way, make sure everybody to go to lookaheadamerica.org, get involved in the grassroots lobbying training. A new one is coming up. Make sure you just go through the entire website. Follow Matt at Matt Brainard if you're still on Twitter and using it. And also on Telegram, which I'm using more. And you can find Matt at Matt Brainard and me at Michelle Malkin. While it's on my mind, I think one of the most important things, just because you're the data guru guy, is just to really have a database of all of the types of people. I mean, hopefully people who will see this, who are friends and family of folks who are facing these types of charges and feel like they're alone, know that you're not alone. And you put this letter out there, you are going to become, sort of ground zero, I think, in people contacting you. And like you said, you've got some lawyers who may be able to help, or may be able to connect people with a local lawyer, if not serve, pro hoc vice in some of these cases, because these are federal cases.
Yeah, sure. And somebody did mention to me that they're seriously thinking about upcharging a lot of these folks who essentially were just trespassing with no mens rea, which is, then you can't. But I will say that, look, again, I'm not a lawyer. It's not like there's a defense fund set up here for anybody, but some have reached out to me, lawyers have said, look, if there's somebody that does need an attorney, send them my way. So if somebody wants to reach out to me, as a couple already have, I will certainly direct you in a direction that could lead to finding a good attorney, because, I mean, public defenders.
Exactly. So look, everybody spread the word, and you can go to Matt's Twitter page and find that letter, and write your own letter as well. Write letters to the editor. If you're still on social media platforms, tweet about it, Telegram it, Facebook, if you're still on that too. There's been always a sort of a split mindset about bailing, right? Because a lot of people have bailed from these platforms, but you're still on Twitter. Are you on Facebook as well?
I am on absolutely everything. Anytime I've got an announcement or something, I have this button I hit on my browser that opens all the tabs and just cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste. And I've actually gotten people push back on me. I'm not beyond just social media, but also television channels where I get invited to go and give my message on, and they're like, you shouldn't do that, or you shouldn't be on those platforms. But we can't be afraid to use the enemy's ammunition against them. And the reality is, this whole thing started, I'll tell you, maybe I'll make a little news here. I sent a letter to a couple of people like immediately after the election within the campaigns. Okay. And I said, look, here's some methods you could use to potentially detect illegal ballots in such a way that you can actually walk into a courtroom with it. Because I know what passes muster in a courtroom. Theories about shootouts at a CIA raid in Germany don't really get you anywhere in a courtroom. But if you can say, look, this was clearly an illegal ballot, or this absentee ballot was sent out incorrectly, those things can add up. And that's actually what flipped the race in New York, because we just recently, or GOP recently picked up a very close seat on the basis of illegal ballots in New York. I think that was just finalized yesterday.
Oh, it was finalized. That's Claudia Tenney's district, right?
Right.
Fantastic.
So that's the kind of stuff that actually matters in a courtroom. And so I sent a list of like, here's the 4 or 5 steps you can take, because I've been in this field for a long time, and that was ignored. And I, out of frustration, said, look, I wrote this list. I'll just tweet it, and I'm done with it. Tweet it. I'm done with it. Tweet it to my less than 200 followers on Twitter. And it just started exploding. And I was actually invited down to the Trump campaign headquarters 2 days after the election because this tweet had started to catch fire. Mm-hmm. I was invited at 9:30 p.m. I put on my very best suit, drove down because it was in Roslyn, and I went to the door, and there were folks inside who wanted me to come in, and there were folks who did not. So I stood on the sidewalk for an hour until about 10:30 p.m. until it was finally resolved after a flurry of phone calls and text messages that I was not going to be let in the building. So I went back to my apartment and I said, look, the initial phase of this is like $100,000. And I put up a tweet on Twitter saying, hey, here's a GoFundMe. Within about 24 hours, we had 220,000 raised. That was then canceled. GoFundMe canceled it because they falsely accused me of spreading misinformation when there was no misinformation spread. I went over to Give, Send, Go, which is actually a much better platform, and quickly raised what we needed to do, the essential research. And like right off the hop, I had to buy $100,000 of data, ultimately $180,000. All of that data was sitting in the headquarters over at the Trump campaign. They already had it. They didn't know what to do with it. They weren't doing what I was doing at all. So I now had to, so it's not just the time to raise the money, but the time to actually acquire it and get it processed. I don't want to get out of the weeds, but we've got some very good data vendors, but they needed to do certain things to it that had already been done there. So the clock is ticking. And these are like really good ways to discover illegal ballots. The easiest way, especially when the margins are this close or when somebody doesn't have residency anymore. That's the easiest way, because we all heard stories of people who were like, I'm in New York City, my vote doesn't count here, but I can get a ballot down in Georgia, I'm going to cast it, right? That happens every election, but rarely does it happen quite to the level it happened this election, and rarely does it happen in an election where it could actually make a difference, because usually we've been saved from illegal ballots over and over again because the margin of victory way surpasses that number. But it didn't this time in three, I would say 3 very pivotal states, 3 states where if they had gone the other way, we would have a different president today. So, but the only reason I was able to do any of that was because I was on Twitter with 200 followers, and one of my followers kind of had like big, like it's like 20,000. He hit the retweet button, and then it kind of exploded. So, I mean, I'm going to warn these states with plan to stop corporate censorship, saying that if you do anything like that, the state's not going to do business with you, right? That's the way you fight these guys. My attitude is, look, if CNN wants to put me on prime time to talk to their audience, that's their mistake, not mine.
Right. Absolutely. Along the same lines, Ryan says, stay in the major platforms while cultivating your alternatives. And that's essentially what we're doing, sort of keeping our feet in all camps and leveraging that power
Right.
that you still do have. And that's such a great anecdote. 200 became 20,000, became hundreds of thousands. How many followers do you have now?
Well, they sort of did this purge. I was up to like 160, but now I'm down to 130. And it seems to float around that number. But the thing we have to remember too is that there are a lot of people in the middle of the world who are very sympathetic to our cause, who are ready to become with us.
Yes.
But they haven't been reached yet. The only place we can reach them is, hey, they're on Twitter, they're on Facebook, they watch, certain channels that we might not want. I don't even have broadcast TV in my house. I don't watch TV, right? Yeah. It's pretty much just Forged in Fire. So that's the only show we watch in my house. But we have to be willing to go into the middle of the world. And I don't want to make any comparisons here, but many people who are very successful in history and had a tremendous impact in history did so by going to places where they could find people, not necessarily the places that they themselves would be found.
That is a great lesson. And that's a great way to end the show. Matt Brainard, thank you so much for your time. Guys and gals in comments on Facebook and YouTube, thanks for watching. Hope you'll spread the word about lookaheadamerica.org. And I know so many of you have been asking me, and this is my concrete answer to you, this show with Matt, what can I do now? Join this grassroots lobbying effort. Get involved. Don't be blaming they, because you are the they and they are the we. How's that for pronouns?
Wonderful. Those are my pronouns.
That's right. Those are our pronouns. We, I, we. Thanks so much, Matt. It was great to catch up with you, and keep up all the great work.
Stay in touch.